It always hits good, that song.
It hits different.
It hits different.
And this episode is hitting different.
Huh?
This episode is hitting different already.
It is hitting different because we're on camera. And should we introduce ourselves to the people who don't know us?
Sure.
For the people who do know us, who listen to our pod, we're going to be doing a little video here in the future. So watch our social media. And if you can't get enough of us,
see us in all of our glam.
Yeah, I don't necessarily recommend it, but
it's definitely it's more comfortable to not be perceived visually,
right,
when we're doing this, so that I can report from my dim basement wearing the oldest sweatshirt that I own. But today,
not today. Yeah, I have a face for radio, but not a voice for radio. So really,
I'm in the wrong face for shutting the heck up and staying the heck out.
So other than that, you should definitely watch and listen.
All right. So who are you, Stephanie Bannon?
Stephanie Bannon. I'm just a small town girl from Nashville.
You're not
neither of those things. No, I live in Nashville, not a small town girl. We're sisters. And I studied foreign affairs and history at the University of Virginia, and I just have a passion for history and a passion for royals. And you?
I am Stephanie's younger sister, and I am currently a neuroscience PhD student at Johns Hopkins. And also I'm obsessed with the royals. So this has been a little project that we've been dreaming up passion project, a child really, that we've been dreaming up for years, and combines our love of history and neuroscience, focusing on royals and rulers throughout our times.
So we launched always talked about, like, we would have conversations about things that we were reading or like movies we were watching and things that you were studying, and we realized that a lot of times they were overlapping.
Right.
And so we're like, how do we get something out there that combines what we love, science, history, and also a little bit of pop culture, because that's another thing that we love. And there's a lot of things that also tie into, you know, what we talk about hundreds of years ago, still relevant.
So we launched our blog, Uneasy Lies the Crown, in 2020, and then the people asked for more, so we launched our podcast. I don't even remember now if it was 2021.
A couple years.
Yeah.
We've got a good stack of episodes.
Yeah, now we are in our new era of visual media. We'll see how it goes. Maybe too much.
Seriously, stop.
It was going on too long. No, now we have audio effects as well. So really, if you've been along for the ride from the beginning, the money's about to start coming in.
And by money, I mean anything.
Anything.
But we're not doing that for the money. We're not doing this for the money.
No, but this is going to be so good that it's going to happen as a result.
I would love to quit my job. If anyone from work is listening, that's not true. I love my job.
Unfortunately, a lot of people from work are probably listening.
Is it fortunate or unfortunate? I'm not sure.
So
that's who we are. That's what we do. And we love doing it along the way. And so, again, I wore my finest outfit for my video debut, rocking Ferrari, because it's been another stellar season for Ferrari.
Yeah. Quite a day to be wearing that after Carlos Sainz retired, but
Well,
I appreciate the
I'm not a
loyalty.
fair weather fan, is all I'll say.
That's for sure.
But they are testing my patience. And I was telling Riley that she looks like I forget her name because it's early. Jenna. She looks like Jenna from the reboot of Real Housewives of New York. So, that was a compliment because
much shorter and not as bony
or rich.
Correct. That too. I look like a poorer, shorter, heavier version of Jenna, former J. Crew creative director and current New York housewife.
Well, if anyone's listening, I know that they cannot wait to see this video because clearly we've pumped ourselves up in how we look and speak. Yeah. So who doesn't want to see us in the flesh?
But what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about my girl Maria from our home country of Portugal.
That is probably for people watching very confusing to hear you call Portugal our home country.
It's not. I think we're 25% Portuguese.
We are Portuguese, that's for sure, but we did not inherit any of the Portuguese aesthetically.
No, we definitely didn't. We got the Irish side, as you can tell from our skin tone. Yes. And this is me tan, by the way, because
we're in the height of summer, ladies and gentlemen.
In the height of summer, and this is your girl tan. So you can imagine what I will be looking like in January. But no, we didn't inherit any of the Portuguese genes. Our siblings did. We've never been to Portugal, and we don't speak any Portuguese. So
we do eat Portuguese sweetbread, and we have one saying in Portuguese that we're pretty sure our grandma taught us wrong, so we're not going to say it here.
Yeah, it's definitely wrong. I still say it anyway. Did you say we eat sweetbread or bake it?
Well, I have done both, but primarily I eat.
Yeah, I don't even know if I've done either because no one ever includes me in that tradition. So
something you'll learn about Stephanie very quickly if this is your first time is that she has the most severe clinical case of FOMO that doctors have ever seen. Maybe we'll do an episode on that.
Is that in the DS?
No, but you're gonna put it in there. Just
did I say that right?
Psychiatrist, if you're listening, there's a case study to be done.
I've seen weirder diagnoses and things in that book, so yeah, we'll do another episode on the science behind FOMO because I believe it's something real and it's something I've suffered my entire life.
She told me to shut up the other day because I texted that our brother and I used to watch movies during the summer when she had already moved out of the house.
I don't want to know what happens when I'm not there.
It's sick.
If it doesn't involve me, one, I don't want to know. And two, I don't want to feel like I've been left out. So please keep it to yourself. And I stand by.
In the future, I'll keep all of my memories to myself because younger than you are.
Yeah. Perfect. Awesome. So no, but today we're going to talk about Maria the First of Portugal. But what's cool, I'll just give you a little taste of where we're going. She actually...
Oh,
did you do a little shimmy?
Yeah, that was specifically for our watchers, not our listeners.
Oh, that's true. Now I gotta... Anyway, we're going to end up in Brazil. So we're going to take you on a little journey. How we get to Brazil, what was wrong with Maria, or maybe nothing was wrong with her, because that's what you'll find in this is we debunk myths. We're myth debunkers.
We are dethroning the lies. We are exposing the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And we are looking okay while doing it.
Looking just okay.
Just fine.
Just barely scraping by. Like, I'm over here like, is Botox starting
Someone
now?
sent me pore strips when listening to our episode, our holiday special a couple years ago when you said that my pores looked big. Imagine what gifts we'll get now that they can actually see the damage.
I will take all of the acne.
Please.
Do that right there.
Specifically, if anyone wants to send us Road Beauty products, we would be delighted.
If you're listening, the reason for the minimal glow I have is from your product. So I will sponsor that till the day I die. Speaking of death, Maria did eventually die in Brazil, and we're gonna talk about how she got there. And what I always say is, how do you solve a problem like Maria?
It's a question that has plagued scientists for the decades.
How do you catch a clown and pin it down?
I don't know any of the other lyrics, otherwise I would go toe to toe with you.
Okay, so let's just jump right in, because we got a lot to cover. A lot happened to Maria, and a lot was happening in this time period. So if you're new to the podcast or video, what we do is I'll give you a little bit of the history, a little background. Then Riley will jump in, talk about some of the biological and the sciencey stuff that I don't understand but pretend to understand. And we'll make a kind of semi-diagnosis. Again, we're not real doctors, shocker. Well, one of us will be eventually, but and then we'll wrap it up and talk about the effects on history. So again, we're talking about Maria today. She was born in Lisbon, Portugal in December of 1734, and she was the daughter of the king of Spain. No, see, I lied. I can't even read. Don't listen to me. She was, her mother, Mariana, was the daughter of King Philip of Spain, and her father was Joseph, who was the future Joseph I of Portugal. Okay. So she was princess. She was the oldest of 4 girls. But what was cool is at the time, what was different than some of the other women that we've talked about is that she was actually her father's legal heir to the throne, even though she was a girl. And as the oldest of her sisters, she was his heir. So there wasn't some of that like back and forth and uncertainty and fighting about who was going to succeed the throne when he died. It was going to be hers by right. And so most people of her station would have a pretty kind of easy childhood. Your job was to study and go to fancy gatherings and have nice clothes. But Maria was a little bit different for her age and her station. Not so much. So she was very religiously pious, which wasn't that uncommon for the time and the age, but like so much so that it consumed her thoughts and led to her constantly worrying about the state of her soul and the souls of her family members. And I don't know about you, but I don't think that I've spent that much time worrying about the state of my soul as an adult. So I definitely didn't spend that much time worrying about the state of my soul and others as a child. Like, yeah, you think about, like, am I going to...
I was made fun of by you for reading the Bible I received for my first communion with pictures in it. So I would say that's probably accurate.
Listen, I worry as much as the next person. Am I going to heaven? Like, what comes after death? Like, you know me, like, I'm like spiritual. I go to church. I'm just saying, like, I don't toss and turn at night being like, oh my God, like,
and we'll touch more on that later. We'll touch
more on it. But it's important to note what she was like as a child. She was a super fun kid, sounds like. So but there were things in her life that led her to worry and believe those things, and then for it to get worse as she got older. It wasn't just all in her head. So one of the most significant moments of both her life and actually the history of Portugal happened in 1755 on All Saints' Day, which was is a religious holiday and was and still is. A devastating earthquake actually took out the city. It triggered tsunamis and fires. It killed between 30 and 50,000 people. Luckily for Maria and the rest of her family, they weren't in the city at that time, so they were spared. They had just left like earlier that morning. But of course, like many people in that day and age, she saw that event and believed that the earthquake was actually like a punishment from God. And again, I know you're going to touch more on that like line of thinking. And it wasn't something that was like unheard of for that day to think of that. And people still think like that today. But this belief in punitive divine intervention was a common theme throughout her life. And it allowed people around her to more easily manipulate her and prey on her fears. So, but let's talk about something fun for a second. Let's talk about young love. So, like the rest of us, Maria like had hopes and dreams of getting married. Not that you have to hope and dream about getting married. It's perfectly single. It's perfectly acceptable if you want to be single. But in Maria's case, she wasn't married until she was 25, which in the 18th century is like grandma status. Yeah. It's like, what are you doing? It would be like me being single at 32, which I am. So I feel for her, but I'm not royalty. So it's not my job to get married and have kids like it was with Maria. So, but that's okay because she did find the man of her dreams. His name was Pedro, and he was her father's brother.
Oh.
So it was her uncle, like every woman dreams of marrying.
I mean, they say that girls like a man who reminds them of their father.
You can't get any closer than that.
She did a real good job.
Yeah, and I just want to like remind people because we talk about incest a lot on this podcast. Much. And my boyfriend
love it.
Huh?
The audience loves it.
They do love it because it's just 1755 was not that long ago.
Yeah.
Like I understand it was like what 228 years ago. Was that right? I haven't taken math in a long time.
I honestly remember. I don't remember what year you said.
That's not that long ago. Yeah. Like it was 1755, not 95. That math was all wrong.
Okay. Well, in any case, it wasn't that long ago.
This woman was marrying her uncle not that long ago.
Yeah.
So, like the case of many of the subjects that we cover, because just the rules that they had in the country about who they could marry and couldn't marry, and they had to keep it kind of in the aristocracy of Portugal. And so when you start cutting down the pools that are available of options, like there's not that many options.
You end up with your uncle.
And you end up with your uncle. And in this case, it was okay. They had 7 children over the next 15 years. So something was working. Something was going right. Well, maybe not. Not all of their children survived, but they did have 2 sons. So they had the coveted heir and the spare, if you know that term. So obviously the royal family, they want 1 son, but then because of the times and the healthcare, the lack of healthcare and all the things that could happen, you always wanted more than 1. And so they did have 2 sons along with their other children, some that did not make it to adulthood. But when Maria was 43, again, just an old hag at this point, she ascended to the throne in 1777 when her father passed away. But the first kind of the signs of trouble with Maria's mental state didn't really come until around 1780, when both her mother and her husband fell ill. So she suffered from what the history books described as an episode of delirium. So Riley, I wanted you to talk a little bit about like delirium, because I feel like even today, like people delirious, like that's a common term. But it does actually mean something.
Yeah, when you asked, I was interested as well because I think I kind of grouped it in with other terms kind of from that era that don't really mean anything anymore, like hysteria, right? Like calling a woman hysterical. But it actually is a medical term that is still relevant and does mean something. So I'm glad we looked it up. And essentially, it's similar to dementia, except that it has a rapid onset instead of gradual over the course of many years. And this can include like decreased awareness of your surroundings. It can be inability to speak or understand speech, issues with your memory, emotional disturbances. And then it's further broken down clinically depending on whether you have increased or decreased like movement in addition to these psychiatric symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And today it's usually caused by emotional distress, sometimes different surgeries or medications, chronic pain, nutritional issues, or if you have like an an injury that brings you to the brink of death. Like those are the situations in which we would see delirium.
So like the kind of stress that she was feeling from these losses could have triggered that.
Yeah, that would be consistent with what we know today.
Well, and that makes sense. And unfortunately for Maria, that was kind of only the start of her struggles in terms of the kind of triggers that she would have over the next few years. So in 1786, her uncle husband, passed away. So that was 4 months. Her husband uncle passed away, and then 4 months later her oldest son, so her heir, died of smallpox. So within the 4-month span she lost her husband and her son, and then her daughter and her daughter's newborn son died of smallpox a few months after that. Then her daughter's husband, so this is Maria's son-in-law, and her daughter's father-in-law, who is King Charles III of Spain, also died. So she
is this different from the daughter who died along with her child?
Her. Yeah, so her husband died, her son died, her daughter died, her daughter's newborn son died, her daughter's husband, so Maria's...
Right, but is it the same daughter?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay, so that whole family is wiped out.
No.
The daughter.
No. Yeah.
The daughter's son, the daughter's husband, and the daughter's father-in-law all died, right?
Yeah,
the same daughter.
Same daughter.
So that whole family's gone.
That whole family is, yes.
Yeah. Done.
Sorry. I thought you were saying Maria's whole family. I think she had like another daughter or two left. But and then her confessor and confidant in the church also passed away. And so saying, what we had mentioned earlier and her like very strong religious beliefs, obviously she would have been leaning on that person through all of the struggles with the loss. And so that was kind of, the straw that broke the camel's back. And honestly, like any person in history would have done, she fell into a pretty deep depression. But the depression continued for years without any improvement. And again, like you would expect, it began to interfere with her duties as the queen. In 1792, she was attending the opera, and then kind of out of nowhere, she became severely agitated, so much so that she had to be carried out of the opera house, screaming and yelling. So she had this, I don't know if you would call it a fit or an episode, that was kind of out of the blue for people that knew her. And then following that, she showed extreme excitability. She refused to eat. She didn't want to take medicine. She didn't want to listen to music. She was really tired. She wouldn't sleep. Her speech was incoherent. And so Maria's doctors were lost for answers, really. They didn't really know how to help her. Obviously, she wasn't cooperating. And I'm sure they tried a lot of things to help her. And so they actually looked to one of their neighbors. They looked to England, to our friend George III. So we've done an episode on George early on. And if you need a refresher of George, you can watch the musical Hamilton. There's a delightful portrayal, maybe not.
I don't know if that would be all the details.
Or better yet, listen to our podcast, because that is an accurate portrayal. But Riley, if you want to give the people who may need a refresher, haven't listened to the episode, a quick reminder of what was happening with George and why Maria's doctors would have looked to them for guidance.
Yes. So it's very interesting that George and Maria were in the same era. I didn't really put that together when we were doing the blog originally, but George was King of England in a very contentious time. This is now post-Revolutionary War. England has now lost the U.S. colonies, and he's also potentially losing his mind, and it's pretty well known. So he kept having these physical illnesses. So, for example, a cold, or later it became more severe where he entered a coma. But then it was accompanied by all of these psychological symptoms and erratic behaviors like hallucinations, violent outbursts. He would talk just nonstop. It wouldn't make sense. So the kind of prevailing theory for a long time among researchers was that he suffered from a disease called porphyria, which is a genetic disease that leads to buildup of toxins in the liver. And then those same toxins can travel to the brain and cause a lot of symptoms. But if you listen to the episode, you'll hear there are some things about that theory that don't quite line up with what we know about what George was experiencing. So the most recent evidence has been that he might have been suffering from bipolar disorder. We also have an episode on bipolar. It was our first podcast episode on Charles of France. Mm-hmm. But this group of researchers in particular analyzed language from letters that George wrote when he was healthy and then when he was having kind of these episodes of mental illness. And by comparing them, they're arguing that there's a potential diagnosis of bipolar. So it would make sense that the doctor treating him would be someone that Maria's doctors would look to for advice, since he was the most high profile doctor treating royals with mental illnesses at the exact same time.
Similar symptoms. I would definitely go back and listen to that, because the porphyria theory, whether or not it's accurate or not, is fascinating to me, because there are people that do suffer from it, and there have been other royals throughout history that they have thought maybe did suffer from this. So super interesting. But so they eventually brought George's doctor over from Portugal to treat Maria, which was actually ended up being kind of unfortunate for her, because he used the kind of classic tricks of the trade at the time, which we've talked about in other episodes, were not great. So treatment and science had not gotten far in that age. So they were using things like the straitjacket, blistering ice baths, basically things that we would call torture in today's age. So,
or self-care.
Or self-care. Actually, a good ice bath is not bad for inflammation every once in a while.
I would consider it torture, but
you would?
Yeah. But this is what happens, people. Abnormal is very subjective, so we have to be careful.
You have to
talk about
Who are
such
we
things.
to judge?
Who am I to judge?
Either way, in an age when they didn't take baths all that often, I have to imagine that Maria did not appreciate this particular type of therapy. Clearly that didn't help her state of mind. It didn't help anything. And even more so, Maria continued to insist that her maladies, or what she was suffering, were punishments from God. And so eventually George's doctor gave up and left. He wasn't willing to stick around to see it through. He had his own problems back at home with his other patient. And so it got to the point, like most of the stories that we cover, where they needed someone to step in for Maria. They needed a regent. At this point, the logical choice was her oldest surviving son, João. I believe that's how you say it, Joao. Also
It has
referred to
like
as
one of
John.
those.
That's like the English version, because English always makes everything less sexy. John. And for
Johns out there listening.
there could be some sexy Johns, you're right.
Yeah.
Call me. No, just kidding. Don't do that.
No.
But for Joao, it was not the time that you wanted to be a regent of any country. Riley alluded to it. France was in the middle of its revolution. Napoleon, you know that guy. We've covered him in our blog. It'll be a future episode. Did we do an episode on him?
Not yet. Yeah.
Oh, we haven't. Okay, good.
Mm-hmm.
That'll be a good one. But Napoleon is at war with England, and Portugal is finding itself like in the middle of that also. But I want to pause here because we've given you a little bit of background on what Maria was suffering and some of her symptoms. So before we talk about kind of the fallout of this regency and what it meant for Portugal, I want to talk a little bit more about what we think was going on with Maria.
Yes. So this is the fun, I think, of Uneasy Lies a Crown, is that
fun.
It's fun, and we want to talk about some science. We want to educate people on different topics that I think will be interesting in neuroscience. But sometimes that's not like the main meat of what's going on. And because we've just been so prolific, we've covered a lot of the topics that are relevant to Maria. So inbreeding, done. Check. It's our Habsburgs episode, and it is our most listened to episode and most read blog post because y'all are nasty. Okay. Then we have
incest. We have the
they
data.
Love it.
Game of Thrones, people love it.
Yeah, it's just enough already.
Freaks.
With your husband, uncles, your uncles, I can't. Then I believe Maria did suffer an infection, right? Like an infectious disease at one point. I came across that in my notes. Anyway, I think
that time, honestly,
our last month we talked about the connection between infection and psychiatric symptoms. That was on Talal of Jordan, another must listen to episode. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, I think we've talked about depression. We've talked about this blurry line between normal grief and then mental illness when we talked about Juana of Castile. But I've had enough depression personally and professionally, so I wanted to talk about something
personally
and professionally. Yes, because the consensus among medical historians is that Maria and actually all of her sisters suffered from major depression and related diseases. And I think that is checking with a lot of what Stephanie talked about and some of her more dramatic symptoms, like these meltdowns and episodes. But there is something distinct that Stephanie also alluded to that I think is worth talking more about, which is Maria's relationship with religion. And I really want to talk about this because I don't think that the neuroscience of religion is talked about enough. And when it is, I think it's kind of done in a lazy way. Lazy bums, just kind of cherry picking data. But, I'm a practicing Catholic like Maria. I'm also a neuroscientist. And I want to respect her religious beliefs and everyone's religious beliefs, but at the same time acknowledge that there is a point where they can become distorted and they can contribute to mental illness. So I want to break that down a little bit.
Let's do it. Break it down.
So I want to go all the way back to the beginning of neuroscience.
Of neuroscience?
Of neuroscience. It's not that old. Okay. We haven't had neuroscience for a long time. I'll make it snappy.
Okay.
But basically, before we had all these cool tools to study the brain, there was only one way we could really learn about what the brain was doing. And that's when something went wrong. So if you take like a psychology course or a biological psychology course, neuroscience course, one of the classic cases that you'll hear about is Phineas Gage, who was this railroad worker. and there was an accident.
Gage or Gage?
Gage.
Gage, okay.
Gage, Gage. There was an accident, and he got a railroad tie through his skull and through his brain, and he survived. And it went through a little something we now call the prefrontal cortex, which is super important for your higher functioning, executive functioning, suppressing inappropriate behavior. And we know this because Phineas Gage, post-accident, was wildly inappropriate, unable to like do his work, hold down a job, take care of finances. He was just like
Completely different
cursing,
person.
having wild trysts everywhere. Yeah. So this is a valid way to understand how the brain works. But I think when we do this in trying to understand how religion works in the brain, actually it becomes misconstrued that, okay, we're taking someone with a case of religious mania and we're going to study them, but then it becomes misconstrued as, oh, well, all people who are religious are mentally ill or delusional or manic, which is not the case. So that being said, I want to talk about where the field of like religion and neuroscience began, which was more recently than Phineas Gage in the 1800s, but we're talking about the 1980s. And there was this article published that year doing what we do, which is looking at a historical figure and trying to figure out what was going on medically with them. And in this case, they were looking at St. Paul, who a huge figure in the New Testament, in the Bible. His story is basically that he was persecuting followers of Jesus after Jesus had already been crucified and then resurrected. So he was going and killing people in the name of Judaism. And then one day he is like struck to the ground with this blinding light. He can't see anymore. And he hears the voice of Jesus telling him to stop persecuting and to go seek out one of his disciples. So Paul does this, and he becomes one of the most important figures in the early church. So we have this story that's very important to Christianity. And then these researchers propose that what Paul experienced was actually a seizure. And more specifically, a temporal lobe seizure. The temporal lobe is the area in your brain important for auditory processing and memory formation. And we talked about seizures more in depth in our episode on Caligula. See, we've covered it so much. We do a lot. So if you want more info on seizures, go listen to that episode. But essentially, a seizure is an event where a region of your brain has like overactivity of like all of your neurons are kind of acting at the same time, which isn't supposed to happen. And depending on where that activity is, you can have different symptoms: visual, auditory, motor. And I didn't know this, but actually 3% of epilepsy patients have religious experiences during, after, or between seizures. So like seeing angels, hearing the voice of God, things like this. And most of the people who have religious toned seizure experiences, they have temporal lobe epilepsy, like was proposed for Paul. There are more modern accounts of these types of seizures, and actually by like some pretty high profile people. I wanted to highlight Dostoevsky, obviously a very famous author, and because of that he left a very detailed account that I just wanted to quote to kind of give you a sense of what this is. So he wrote, quote, "The air was filled with a big noise, and I thought that it had engulfed me. I have really touched God. He came into me myself. Yes, God exists. I cried, and I don't remember anything else. You all healthy people can't imagine the happiness which we epileptics feel during the second before our attack. I don't know if this felicity lasts for seconds, hours, or months, but believe me, for all the joys that life may bring, I would not exchange this one."
Wow.
So here he has an awareness.
Happened during his episodes.
Yeah. So he had an awareness that it was a seizure. And yet he still believed that like this religious experience was real and valid. And he wouldn't trade it. Like he said, he wouldn't want to get rid of the seizures if it meant that he lost this encounter with the divine.
Right.
But unfortunately, like I said, this kind of research has been exploited and used to put forward the idea that religion is just a delusion. It's something that happens when your brain is going wrong. But I think it's worth pointing out, like not everyone who has seizures is religious or has religious encounters. Like we said, only 3%. And not everyone who is religious has had an auditory or visual or sensory experience of the other world. So I did find a couple of researchers from NYU. Our sources are in our original blog post, so if you're interested in reading more, you can look at that. But they did a whole review of research between epilepsy and religious experiences. And I think that they very well explained that this doesn't mean that religion is a product of delusion or a neurological disease, but rather that because something in the brain is happening and then there's a religious experience, that this is pointing to the fact that there is a neurobiological basis for religion, which is very different. So I thought that was pretty interesting. All of this is to say that there is a thin line between religious fervor, religious mania, and this is a very sensitive topic. It's very personal to people. And I don't want to make blanket statements that, anyone who has a vision of God is mentally ill, or, people who are in religious communities and they have very extreme practices are like crazy. That's just not right. So I thought that was important to lay out before I go specifically into Maria's relationship with religion.
Yeah, makes sense.
Good. Okay. So Maria, as Stephanie pointed out, from early childhood, she showed like a propensity for religious things, religious ideas, practices. And it seems like even before her decline, she had a little bit of a harsh view of God, right? That like this earthquake is punishment for sin. And then
very,
later,
like, Old Testament God.
Very Old Testament, yeah. Vengeful, lack of mercy. And after her mental illness, she was like, well, this is also punishment from God. And she was, like you said, fixated on the possibility of damnation, and the faith that she had was actually distressing. She was just, I think that it's fair to say the anxiety about what was going to happen to her soul was contributing to her depressed mood because her thoughts were very negative.
Yeah. And I just want to also point out there's a lot going on within the country in terms of like religious, I don't want to say war, but tense religious issues between Catholics and non-Catholics, and so there was a lot also happening, and so it was too much to kind of go into here, but again, I go more into it in the blog, so you can get more of a background as to the stressors around her and the people that were kind of taking advantage of those fears as well. So
yeah, thank you for adding that context. So the kind of word that came to mind idea when I was learning about Maria was Catholic guilt. I think we have definitely heard that phrase before. I think it's a stereotype that like, not just Catholics, but particularly Catholics, obviously because of the phrase, it's like you feel unnecessary guilt about things. But there's actually a pathological version of this Catholic guilt that's kind of tossed around, and that's called scrupulosity, which is not only recognized by the Catholic Church as something that's not right, and that needs to be addressed, but is also, as we'll talk about, falls under the umbrella of a mental illness that can be diagnosed by medical professionals. So the National Catholic Register defines scrupulosity as excessive anxiety about the sinfulness of particular actions. And scrupulosity can result in people like, in the Catholic Church, there's confession. You go, you confess your sins, and you receive absolution or forgiveness from God. But these people will keep confessing the same thing that they've done and already received absolution for, because they don't think that they can actually be forgiven. And often this involves the church differentiates between a mortal sin and a venial sin, with a mortal sin being more severe. And often these people have not committed a mortal sin, but they're convinced that they have. So far from what people might think, the church does not want this, because it shows like a disturbance and a misunderstanding, really, of the faith. And it is actually just a specific form of something that we're all pretty familiar with, obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. I'm glad that we're talking about OCD, actually, because we like to, again, debunk myths. And I think that there's a big misunderstanding of what OCD is in popular culture. If I hear someone
throw around that word all the time.
I'm so OCD. I just love color coding my pens, so I'm OCD. No, shut up.
I love organizing my towels. I'm so OCD.
Yeah. My bookshelf is color coded, and I dust a lot. Like, no, that's not what OCD is. What is OCD?
Obsessive.
It's obsessive. Yes, people have unwanted, intrusive, unpleasant thoughts that are just constantly in their head. And the way that they cope with this is a repetitive action. So the obsession is the thought that's causing anxiety. And then the compulsion is whatever action you do to try and bring the anxiety down. So scrupulosity specifically would be your obsessive thought is that you are going to hell, that you've committed this horrible sin. And then your compulsion might be praying, going to confession, taking on a penance, but it's not actually square with reality.
Right.
So
and it interferes with your life, whatever the compulsion is, interferes with a normal life or routine.
And while the intention of this compulsive behavior is to bring the anxiety down that the obsessive thought is causing, it actually only feeds it further. So actually that goes right into what I wanted to talk about next, which is what we know from neuroscience about what's happening in the brain with people with OCD. And the findings reflect the clinical symptoms pretty well, which is interesting. So I'm talking mostly about this 2019 paper from researchers at the University of Michigan. And they were doing MRI studies, or they kind of compiled a bunch of MRI studies comparing OCD patients to control patients. And these studies were focused on measuring something called inhibitory control. Inhibitory control is measured in tasks where kind of two kinds. One is you need to perform a task, and in order to do it, you have to ignore something else that's happening in the background. So the inhibition is like, don't pay attention to this, just focus on your task. The other version might be that you started to do a task and then you receive a signal that you should stop it, and you need to stop it to complete your trial successfully. When you make an error on this kind of a task, there's a certain type of signal that the brain will send to try and correct your output, to try and get you to your goal. But in OCD patients, while this message is still sent, the area of the brain that's receiving it doesn't listen, let's say, to keep it simple. So the error message just keeps playing stronger and stronger and stronger to try and get you to adjust your behavior. And they found that the overactivity of the error signaling ended up making the person more anxious, which caused more mistakes and then amplifies the error signal further. So this has been repeated or found in other types of experiments that are investigating OCD. But the neural response to errors in inhibitory control mirrors the symptoms of OCD in that the compulsive behaviors often trigger this kind of error response because they're actually often at odds with what a person wants to do. So the example I'll give is that someone whose compulsive behavior is washing their hands, they're going to find it really hard to decorate a birthday cake. So the error message is just going to be triggered over and over and over. And because you're unable to suppress the hand washing, you're just going to get more anxious and then keep washing your hands because you think, okay, well, if I can't stop washing, then it must be important that I keep washing my hands. And then the goal is never met. So currently to treat OCD, clinicians will use
vicious cycle.
Yeah, vicious cycle. Yeah. So to try and get patients out of this, there's therapy. There is medication, usually like an antidepressant. But there are people that these treatments don't work for them and they still have this battle between the obsessive thoughts and the compulsive behavior. So the next kind of phase of OCD treatment is hopefully to correct the impaired neuronal communication, to correct this error signaling. This research has kind of been going on since the 1950s, where doctors found success in treating OCD patients if they just kind of like damage, kind of like a lobotomy, but specifically a part of the brain called the cortico-striato-thalamocortical circuit. And this actually overlaps with the error signaling pathway I was talking about with the previous paper. So
right now, that's the best we've got with research?
No, because we're not just going around blading people's brains anymore so much. So yeah, we're trying to kind of create a better way. And that's where something called deep brain stimulation is coming in. Some people might be familiar with deep brain stimulation from Parkinson's research. The idea is you put an electrode inside the brain and then it's attached to essentially a pacemaker. So it's a pacemaker for your brain where it'll trigger electrical activity to kind of keep your neurons signaling like they should be. So the idea is to put this electrode inside of the cortico-striato-thalamocortical circuit and then try and regulate the signaling so that the patients are actually able to receive that error signal and change their behavior because of it. Unfortunately, because it is experimental and thus only for people with like treatment-resistant OCD, there's not a ton of evidence at this point. It's going to take years to accumulate. And hopefully we'll design something where, it's not as invasive. We don't need to put an electrode into your brain to make this work. But as we gain more information about the altered communication patterns in the brain of OCD patients, we're closer to being able to treat this disease.
But of course, that right there, like, it's clearly more serious than just like, oh, I like to make my bed every morning because I'm OCD.
Yes. No. And I hope that's what people can take away from this episode is, I'm not trying to police what you say, but there are people really suffering from this disease. And I think that's kind of like one neurological disease or mental illness that's kind of tossed around in a careless way. So next time you want to describe yourself as OCD, maybe just think about these people.
Think
And
about what you say. I'm not perfect, but I throw around words like "that's crazy" or "you're crazy" or but that one in particular is like an easier one to kind of correct.
Yeah, it's like you're not. You would know.
You would know. Yeah. You wouldn't be able to get out the door in the morning on time. I mean, some people can't, but like in a serious way, with some of the things that people suffer from before even having to, do an easy thing like just leaving the house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Of course, Maria didn't have access to therapy or medication or deep brain stimulation to kind of help her through this unhealthy obsession and just kind of vicious cycle of compulsion and anxiety and obsession. So that's how we ended up where we ended up, which is where.
Well, and thank God though, because back then, for sure they would have been all over a lobotomy. They
my God,
lobotomy.
They would have right up the nostril and
like, oh, she's better now. She can't talk or move. That's good. Just like a regular woman, we love it. Just sit there and shut up.
Just as a woman should be.
Sorry, I just saw Barbie, so my feminism is through the roof at the moment.
I have a hot take that it's just as much a positive film for men, but we can save that to a later episode.
Do tell. You brought your Kenergy to this episode?
I'm bringing my Kenergy. I think the movie is equally pro-Ken. People think that it was just kind of like ragging on men, but you can see
he wanted to be included too and loved.
Exactly. Ken goes to the real world. He sees men can be respected. Then he takes it too far, right? Because he's had no power, no acknowledgement. The man's in pain. And then that doesn't go well either. And he learns that he can't define himself by his masculinity. He can't compensate for what he's looking for by having this
chiseled abs.
Mojo Dojo Casa house. He can't. And then I think, it's cheeky. Of course, they're like, you can't have all of the like equal seats in our government because it's a movie. But I think overall, they encourage the men to be empowered, have their own healthy place in society. And
without being like so like put down, like put off if a girl can achieve something too. It's like there's room for both.
There's room for both.
But also
therefore I am moving to Barbie Land.
Yes. I think that I took all of the wrong messages from that movie because I left the theater being like, I want every single outfit that Barbie was wearing. And Ken / Ryan Gosling is incredibly hot and a great player. So I think I missed really all of the.
Did you cry?
Yes, I cried.
Okay, good. Okay.
Ridiculous. Like when Ruth showed up, I was like, forget about it. Spoiler alert.
Forget about it. So that was a fun interlude. That's what we love to do on this show.
That's why we're here, is to science, history, pop culture.
A meeting of the minds.
A meeting of the minds. People listening can't see that I just intertwined my fingers like so.
And your nails look lovely.
I'm just happy here. Thank you. Except don't look at this one. Oh, I just flipped you off. Don't do that. That one broke. But yes, so now that we've talked about what Maria maybe did or didn't suffer from, like Riley said, we've talked about a lot of the other things that she probably did suffer from, like depression and anxiety. But certainly the religious factors played a large role in how she and what she believed she was suffering from, or what she believed she was being punished for, and by whom. And that kind of vicious cycle that did not help some of the other factors that were going on. So thank you, Riley. Just to kind of close out what happened to Maria after we had this regency with her son. Again, like I was saying about the time period, France was in the throes of this revolution, and Napoleon was now in power, and he was going after England, which was the other main power of the time. And Napoleon came to Portugal and said, I need you to close your ports to England or you're going to be next on my list. And so this was kind of an impossible choice. It was a lose-lose for Portugal and for Joao, because they were going to make someone else mad, someone else that was more powerful than them, whether it was England or Portugal. But they decided they were a loyal bitch. They were like, no, we're not turning our backs on our boy England. So come get us. And unfortunately, Napoleon was not bluffing, and he did. So he marched in 1808 against Portugal. And like any great ruling family, Joao decided, we're going to get the heck out of here. It's your problem. It's your problem, Portuguese people. And they loaded on the royal family and the entire court, loaded themselves onto some big boats. There were about 10 to 15,000 people. And it was kind of like in a movie where they're on the boats getting ready and they can see the French like marching towards them and sailing towards them. And so they got out pretty much in the nick of time, left the rest of the people of Portugal to fend for themselves. So really stand up guy. To Maria's credit, she did not want to go. She was basically carried kicking and screaming to her boat. She didn't really have a choice in the matter. Of course, we don't know if she really understood what was happening or if she just like didn't want to leave her house. Either way, she didn't want to do it. I'd like to believe she didn't want to leave her people, but I don't know that I can say she was in the state of mind, again, to understand the kind of implications of the fact that they were leaving. So where they were going was Brazil, which no one there had been to. So when I'm escaping the throes of death, I always like to go somewhere that I've never been.
Why did they pick that?
So they picked Brazil because Brazil was actually a colony of Portugal.
Oh, it was already a colony.
It was already a colony. So if anyone like myself had ever wondered growing up, like why the majority of South America speaks Spanish and then Brazil speaks Portuguese, that is why. It was actually a Portuguese colony. So they knew that it was going to be at least a place that was loyal because they owned it. The problem was that, again, none of the royal family or really anyone from Portugal had been there other than the people that conquered it and were there working, for the trade. So they landed in they ended up living in Rio de Janeiro, where the town was not ready for them, was not ready for a royal family or any type of size of the party that they were bringing, because it was very much just like a rural place. It didn't have any type of infrastructure to support them. So when they got there, Joao spent years building the city physically, creating churches, libraries, schools, banks, basically everything that you would need.
All for Ryan Lochte to trash his gas station at the Olympics.
Him and his frosted tips. What an embarrassment. Joao did not die for that.
No.
I loved it. It was great
for your
me
international scandal. Yeah, I loved it because Billy Bush got fired because of it. So it was a win.
He outed him on the beach?
No, because he saw Ryan Lochte on the beach and asked him about it, and Ryan Lochte totally lied, and then he just believed him without doing any journalism. So he got fired. Right. So, international scandal, firing Billy Bush. In the end, I think it was a net positive for the world.
I think so. It really, Billy Bush played that wrong because it really could have catapulted his career, and in the end, it did the opposite. But needless to say, when Joao and Maria landed in Rio, that is what they envisioned for the country for the next hundreds of years was to be the home of the Olympics and the greatest international Olympic scandal. That's not even it overpasses. What's the
overshadows
the doping? Yeah, the doping scandal. Even
I would say that Bob Costas' pink eye and Sochi still is way up there. I like to remind people of that whenever I can.
Anymore, I just watch it for possible pink eye and scandals. But anyway, so they landed there, and João immediately started building up the country. Clearly, he did not have any plans to return back to Portugal and those poor people there who are now under French rule. And Maria, her, not surprisingly, that type of voyage did not help her condition. And so she was placed in a convent when they arrived, and she remained there for the rest of her life. So again, it's just fascinating to me that, we don't know what would have happened if Maria was in charge of calling the shots at this point. Would she have decided to back England or France? Would she have decided to run? We don't know. So that is one of the fascinating things about this story and all of these studies, is because, if she had not been suffering like she was, the course of history could have been completely different. Maybe the royal family didn't go to Brazil and pour all of this money and resources into Rio, and build it up and made it into one of the powerful cities that it was and that it is. But in 1816, Brazil did eventually graduate from a colony to a kingdom. Good for it. It grew up. And as a result, Maria was then, technically the queen of Brazil and Portugal, even though she wasn't actively ruling. But she was unfortunately only the queen of Brazil for about 3 months before she passed away at the age of 81, which I have to say, given everything that she had been through and her poor health and the voyage and the stress, 81 today is a good life. Yeah. And back then, I mean, she saw a lot. We don't know a ton or really much about her life when she made it to Brazil, again, because she was kind of shut away. But she did make it back home eventually after her death. So João did return to Portugal. He didn't actually really want to. He liked kind of the life and the world that he created in Brazil, but he did do his duty as king, and he went back once Napoleon was defeated. And he brought his mother's remains with him. So her final resting place was actually and is actually Portugal. And then João's son, Pedro, stayed behind in Brazil. And he became the Emperor of Brazil in 1822. So, so we don't know a ton. There's very little written about Maria, even though we were able to, find enough to have this discussion, because she was a queen in a very significant time in history. Like, we talked about George, the King of England. We talked about Napoleon. I mean, these are huge players. So it's not insignificant the time period that she lived and when she ruled. And clearly, Portugal was an important enough of a country that Napoleon wanted to go to war over it. They had those port cities, so they were an important country. And so, like we talked about, Maria clearly suffered from more than just an average case of depression, if she wasn't able to rule during this time and her son had to take over. And we will never know what would have happened if she had been in a stable state of mind. But that's the fun, right? We wouldn't be talking about it if we did know the answers.
We love to speculate.
Speculate is the name of this game. Don't hate the speculation, hate the game. But don't hate the game, because the game is
love
fun
the game. Like and subscribe to the game.
Like and subscribe to the game.
It is interesting, like this compared to our episode on Charlotte. Those are like the only two rulers that we've covered that were in the Western Hemisphere. And right. Like how they turned out poorly for different reasons. Like the fact that João was happy and would have stayed in Rio is kind of the opposite of what happened with Charlotte and her husband in Mexico.
Yeah, if you want very similar kind of stories in terms of like women who ended up in the, like you said, in the Western Hemisphere, not really because they wanted to necessarily. I think Charlotte was a little more on board because at the time she had not started suffering mentally before they left, but that's another great one to listen to. And yeah, because most of all the stories that we're covering, because we don't really have royalty over here, but we did, and you don't realize the royalty that was in the Western Hemisphere until you start listening to us. So you're welcome.
I asked Thomas, our current former editor, and my husband, who he thought was the royal family, like royal couple of America the other day, and he said Harry and Meghan, which was a cop-out. That's not really what I meant. So I was wondering if you had an answer for that.
I'll tell you what it's not. It's not Jay-Z and Beyonce.
Okay. I thought you were going to say Colin Jost and Scarlett Johansson because of that old headline.
Oh, did someone say that they were?
That they were like the royal family of America. I think it was just to get hate clicks, and that worked.
Okay, well, I would have hate clicked it. I'm hate clicking it now. Yeah, it's definitely not Jay-Z and Beyonce, and that's probably an unpopular opinion, so we might lose some fans with that take. Some people would still say the Obamas.
Sure.
And I could see that. Do you have one?
Well, what triggered this for me is that Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds are spending so much time in England because he has a soccer team, but it sounds like they actually might move there. And I was like,
no, we can't lose them. Did we do
a
trade for Meghan and Harry?
Do they want to be Harry and Meghan? Is that what's happening?
I'll tell you, the investments that he's made in a very short amount of time, he is making a play for the royal family in America. So
here, I love Taylor Swift as much as the next girl. I don't want her anywhere near the royal family for everyone's benefit. I do not want that. So Blake is going to have a little bit of distance there.
Is Taylor going to be around the royal family?
No, but if Blake was around the royal family, Taylor might be because they're such good friends.
Yeah, the last thing we need is Taylor to date anyone in the royal family. I don't even care if it's like a 17th cousin of an earl.
No,
I don't need that.
We don't need it. We saw what happened when she became obsessed with the Kennedys and dated a teenager. That was just bizarre.
Oh God. That was maybe the one time I respected her, to be honest.
Because she was doing a Jackie O play?
Because she was doing a cougar play.
Oh.
It's like, okay, go off, queen. Although it was definitely illegal, so not that part, but
yeah.
All right, well, that's a good question. Let me think about that for the next episode, because I think it is a great question. But yeah, if you want to learn more about the royals that did live in the Western Hemisphere and how some of the countries that are our neighbors are shaped today because of their European ancestry, then definitely listen to Charlotte, and then
listen to this,
and George, because
George
that shaped this country as well. So, but thanks for joining us. As always, for our loyal listeners and for our first time listeners, it was a pleasure, a real pleasure.
A delight.
Until next time. Oh boy.